We are speaking with Dr. Prabodh Banavalkar, who is the winner of the Council's 2009 Fazlur Khan Lifetime Achievement Award, and he's been in professional practice for more than 40 years, so we're going to speak about 40 years of structural solutions for tall buildings, among many other things. Welcome to Chicago. Welcome back to Chicago.
As a matter of fact, yes.
Because you started at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill in 1966?
That's correct.
So you have quite a history in this city just alone.
Yeah.
And you have the distinction of designing the structural systems for over 25 buildings taller than 600 feet or 180 meters, but all of that started here in Chicago.
That's correct.
And as we go through your history, I think probably it would be good to divide it up into decades and speak about what the technology is for each of those. But first of all, I must ask you, what are your feelings about winning the medal named for Fazlur Khan?
Well, I can't be more happier and very delighted that I received the award in the name of a person who signifies excellence in designing tall buildings. He was the pioneer in all sense of the word, because Dr. Khan really changed the way people thought about designing tall buildings in 60s. Before that, people designed tall buildings, but to evolve a structural systems which is cost-effective, at the same time performance-oriented, that thought process actually was started to a large extent by Dr. Khan. And as I said, I was very privileged to have worked for him for a short period of time in 1960s when I was at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill. But the philosophy that he propounded when he started designing the building is what I followed in all my professional career.
What did you get from him the most?
Well, I may not have worked for him that long in terms of a close association, but what was very important to get from him is that when you design these buildings, there is always a better way to build a new mousetrap. And designing buildings by the old-fashioned conventional way is not the only way. You can think about modifying and coming up with different forms of structural systems, utilizing the basic knowledge of structural engineering, and also combining materials. Like, you don't have to design an all steel building, you don't have to design an all concrete building. You can combine them, steel, concrete, create a composite building, and do it more on a technical basis rather than the old-fashioned conventional way of designing buildings. So that was a very, I would imagine, those days was a very revolutionary thinking in those days, because in the early 60s and when all this started, Dr. Khan had written a very pioneering paper at that time called Shear Wall Frame Interaction, and I still have a copy of the original paper that he wrote, in which he illustrated how does a building with a shear wall and frames act together, what is the interaction between those two. Prior to that, most of the buildings that were designed, people used the conventional system, and they were using mainly moment frames, just the rigid frames in the thing. There were buildings which had used bracings in the building, like Empire State Building, but there was not a scientific approach to solving that problem as to what each component in the building does to give the lateral resistance to the building. Main theme that Dr. Khan put forward at that time was that designing the tall building is not just stacking one floor on the top of another. As the scale of the project changes, the other forces, namely the wind, seismic, these forces come into play. And when these forces come into the play, the whole structural system as a whole should be looked at in a different context. And that was the most important thing that I learned at that time.
When you talk about the old way of doing things versus the new way of doing things, just to kind of simplify that, I guess the old way of doing things would be like the Empire State Building, where you just built kind of a grid, a steel framework for it.
That's
but
right.
The new way, I guess, would be something like the John Hancock Center or the Sears Tower, where you come up with different ways of supporting the structure.
Exactly.
And the whole the whole gift of being able to design a structural system for the building, and I'm told that you have a very unique ability to look at a design and kind of visualize right there what the skeleton of that
Right.
should be. You're trying to say, you're trying to provide the support, you're trying to save materials and do so with the least amount of materials. What are you trying to do when you design a structural system?
Well, I think when I try to design a structural system, I would like to bring something which was published by Dr. Khan in 1960s. He had imagined in his thing that if you build a building, however tall it is, and you shield it or protect it from wind loads, that was his main thing. In other words, he had drawn a picture of a dome which is protecting a building. And he had plotted a curve showing the amount of structural steel that you need to design a building of different heights. If you were to design that building only for the gravity loads and not design anything pertaining to the lateral loads, which is the wind loads or the seismic loads, you need certain amount of steel. It's a linear line as what you call the floors. Whether you build a floor at the first floor or you build the same floor at the 50th floor, the weight of the floor for gravity design is the same. It doesn't change because the gravity doesn't change. But to give the lateral stability to the building and the performance of the building so that the building doesn't deflect too much, people who occupy the upper floors of the building do not have motion perception problems, all these issues, you have to put more steel into the building. In other words, you have to provide this system which adds more steel to just designing building carrying the lateral load. So these two curves showed that as the building height changes, the amount of steel you need to give this performance to the building for the lateral loads increases. So these two lines kind of diverge from each other. The one line remains straight line, which is just the gravity type design, other one's designing for lateral load. Now the efficiency of your structural system, if you want to use that as an index in your design, the gap between the two curves should be minimized. You should bring this as close as possible. That means, ideally, if you could design a building, tall building, which is subjected to these forces of nature, namely wind, seismic, and so on and so forth, if you just design it only for gravity, yet it will work for wind and things, that is your ultimate goal. So whenever I had an opportunity to design a building, within the confines of the architecture, in other words, the architect comes up with the different shapes, forms, and expressions, I would always look to come up with a structural system within the framework of the architecture which gives you the maximum efficiency of the structure. Now, Heath's curve that he prepared, Dr. Khan, was prepared only for steel structures, was an indication for he had not a curve for a concrete or a composite building or things like that. We changed later on. The whole line of thinking has developed over number. But the basic principle still remains the same, that you want to make the structure as efficient as possible so that the cost of the structure within the framework of the structure is minimized. So whenever a problem is presented to me primarily on a building, what I look for within the framework of the architecture, how can I find a lateral load resisting system, which is what adds cost to the building, because gravity is gravity no matter where you are, and come up with a system which will achieve that goal. And that is the theme with which I worked on all my buildings for the last 40 years of my life. Now, initially I started as a young engineer, and then I kind of worked and perfected my technique as I went along. But that is the basic theme of the design of all these buildings that I worked on.
Well, we're going to start talking about going through the years here and starting in 1966 when you began at SOM, and in 1966 the John Hancock Center was just into construction, so that's probably a real good place to start in that. I know you didn't work on that building, but there's a prime example of how we're talking about new technology versus the old system. What was going on with structural engineering in the late 1960s, and what did you see and work on?
Well, the The thought process, for example, in John Hancock, putting a diagonals, exterior diagonals on the building was very revolutionary because people always thought the building expression, exterior expression of the building should always be vertical beams and columns. They did not imagine. But providing this exterior bracing on John Hancock building, take them the quantity of steel down to something like, I don't remember exact number, something like 29, 30 pounds a square foot for a building of that height. If that building was built by conventional way, by putting columns and beams and moment frames and all these things, that would have come somewhere in the neighborhood of 47 to 50 pounds a square foot. For example, World Trade Center, which has a similar system with the vertical columns and beams, which are moment frames, have a steels, if I remember correctly, somewhere in the neighborhood of 47 pounds per square foot. It's slightly taller than John Hancock, but still, so you're talking about cost differential of 29 to 47 is about 18 pounds a square foot. And if you take, even if those days, if the steel was costing 50, 60 cents a square foot at that time, you're talking somewhere about in the neighborhood of $12, $13 a square foot less. And when you convert that to the millions of square feet of the building, it's a big dollars that you're talking about.
What were you working on during the period?
I was working on relatively smaller buildings at that time. I worked on a Gateway Plaza, which was a composite building that had come up with, that was one of the earliest composite building that Dr. Khan had come up with in Gateway Plaza, which was built over the railroad track over there. And it had a concrete perimeter, concrete columns, but the building was a composite building. It had a steel floor and erection steel columns, and then they were clad in concrete to provide the lateral resistance to the building. I also worked on a building which was not, I think Skidmore was moreover a consultant to the building, a building in Australia, BHP Tower, which was like 40 stories tall building. And I'd worked on that one too at the time. But important thing here is, Jeff, that the most important part was every time we tried to come up with a solution, the theme was the same. Finding the efficiency, less amount of steel without compromising performance.
As far as your own career went, moving into the 70s now, that was such a huge era in tall building design. A lot of things went on during the 1970s. Is that when your career started to really take off in that regard?
Yes, yes, very much so. In early part, I worked for a firm in Houston, and there again, the buildings that we designed were basically all steel buildings, because tall buildings, those days, steel was the favorite material. But in 1972, I designed a building called Pennzoil Place. The concept was by Dr. Colasso had the concept of it, which had a concrete wall. It was a composite building, but a concrete wall and the perimeter was a steel in the building. Now, this mixing of this material had just started. As I said, in late 60s of these composite buildings, and One Shell Square that was designed by Skidmore, Dr. Khan had done it, also had the same type of thing, but it did not have a shear walls. It had the perimeter concrete columns. This one, mixing the buildings with putting the concrete shear walls and perimeter structural steel, actually started in late 60s, very late 60s, early 70s. And the Pennzoil Place, designed by Philip Johnson, a famous architect, had the concrete shear walls and the perimeter steel frame. The benefit of this thing was that the concrete being the material that it is, it saves roughly of the order of 6 to 7 pounds per square foot equivalent of structural steel to the building, which is a substantial cost. So, and then it presented a lot of other interesting issues with buildings of Pennzoil Place, because the shape of the building was different. The tools that we had, computers, were not as sophisticated as you got these computers now. Those days, to analyze this building in computers, you had to create a lot of small models to idealize the building. You had to create substructures and analyze the substructures, and from the substructures, you had to make the big structure. and do it. Because the cost of running programs for those kind of buildings, which is nothing today, was substantial, like $30,000-$40,000 a computer run. Because we used to go and use what you call your the data centers. You know, there were no personal PC computer, somebody sitting and.
And they probably took up the size of a small building, I'm sure, to run computer simulations.
Yeah, and we used to use a computer program from McDonnell Douglas called Strudel, which became what you call second phase of stress. Just to give you an idea, when they did the John Hancock building, it had something like, somebody told me, I don't know the exact numbers, 900 members, or some very small number, and it was a big issue. Now a 900 member or 900 joints, a little kid sitting on that, his computer can do it in 15 minutes. Mm-hmm. So the scale has dramatically changed. So when you do this kind of building those days, you had to really get into the structure to understand the behavior of each component, and you try to mix concrete and steel. The problem were even more complicated to solve.
Is that a good summation of the 70s, is that we started to see the composite buildings?
Yes.
Are there other innovations or other things that came along in that decade?
There were a lot of structural systems as such were developed, which were different compositions of the systems. But the composite buildings started coming out strong in 70s. And then they developed further as time went along.
What did that allow you to do in terms of a building design that maybe you couldn't have done before under the old system?
In terms of those buildings? Well, the cost, the shapes of the buildings became, people departed from square rectangular shapes of the buildings. If you see even John Hancock is a tapering rectangle. Whereas Pennzoil Place is like a building which has got up to 31st floor, building is vertical and then the roof slopes. So the idea would be to try to use the shape of the building to your advantage. That is one of the things which I tried to practice. In other words, never try to fight the architecture. Whatever architecture gives you, within the confines of architecture, you develop a system which makes the architecture stay as it is. But it saves money so that the structure becomes cost effective and viable, because no matter what, most of my buildings, I worked for developers. For them, their performa has to be met. At the bottom line has to be met. In other words, it costs so much and they're get so much rent, and all the returns have to be there. So for that purpose, you have to have a system which responds to the shape of the building. At the same time, it does the function. So the composite buildings, for example, as I said, a composite building versus all steel building, you save about 6 to 7 pounds a square foot of structure, which is a substantial amount of cost, and makes that project becomes much more competitive for the developer to build it.
And you get much more, you get a lot of different shapes and
exactly, different shapes, forms.
And one of the things that comes to mind, and we're probably moving into the 80s now, is the Fountain Place in Dallas, which I believe is an IMP design, is that right? And I was actually in the very top of that building. I think it was a 40-story building and
60 stories.
60 stories, okay. And I was up at the very top, and I found out that they had a little stairway and a little platform up there labeled 61. So these are the statistics that we're always trying to run down. And I guess that's a good example of the fact that these architects come up with all of these wonderful designs, but it's the structural engineer that's got to make it work.
Yeah. Now, a light bank that I designed for it is, I put my structural system tailored for the shape. Now, just to give you an idea of that building, there is a big opening at the bottom for the fountains and all that. And I think, if I remember right, there is 184, and then there is about 150 feet wide opening. So the system that was devised was created with the shape of the building. Diagonals were put at a slope of 2 to 1, creating a diagonal trusses, and a launching truss at the base where there was a mechanical room by which this diagonal framework can be built on. And just to give you efficiency of that structure with that shape and that form required only 21 pounds per square foot of structural steel. a rectangular building built across the street there, another 60-story building, which I don't want to name, has a square building, has also 61 pounds, 21 pounds per square foot of structural steel. So even though the shape was so unique and had these huge transfers at the base, devising the structural system to follow the profile of the building and create this diagonal system allowed you to put it only 21 pounds of steel in it, which was very cost effective, made the building viable for it. Now, before that building, I designed also Texas Commerce Tower, which was, I don't know what is it called, Chase Tower now, which was the tallest building in the country at that time, west of Mississippi, which was a composite building, which is the same type of system as what the gateway system is, whereby the steel framework goes up and then the perimeter of the building is cladded in concrete, as concrete columns come about, concrete beams come around. And the uniqueness of that building was there was a 74 feet open span, because IMP wanted to have open span looking towards the downtown area of Houston. Well, that was a building which required little modifications to the conventional line of thinking of putting tubes, because if you take up your Coke can and split it in the middle and you apply load to it and you try to twist it, you will see two ends of the Coke can move up and down. So we had to put a shear wall in the middle and tie the perimeter tube, close it off in some form so that the building will function satisfactorily as you would have under the lateral wind load. Otherwise, the building of that nature, if a wind comes on it, if you don't have this linkage, if you try to twist the building, the two ends of the building will move 5 inches up and down at the top.
So did this change? I guess we are talking about the 80s now, right?
Right. This is late 70s, early
80s when we started seeing buildings of this shape. Did this allow you to come up with lighter, stronger structures?
Well, what it allowed me personally to come is to apply a lot of times the theory which were developed by a lot of pioneers in the field of theory, like this warping of the tube and all that. The theory comes from Vlasov, a famous Russian engineer. And the hulls of the ships and everything are built with this theory of, in other words, if you take an open section and you twist it, the two ends of the open section move relative to each other. So how do you bandage them together is something that was used by Vlasov in his design of the hulls of the ship, aeroplane structures and all that, which I was able to apply to the shapes and forms of these buildings. I did that for a building in Houston also, another building whereby I tied the two ends of the building, putting bandages at a specific critical location by which this warping goes away and the structure acts very efficiently for that kind of shape and form. So I always have done engineering applying the theoretical knowledge, not just the computers, translated into applying to the shapes and forms of the buildings.
I guess after a while you must get a feel just by looking at a drawing or a form, the dynamic, the things that are going on inside that structure and the potential conflicts. Is that right? You get a visual feel for that?
I always say that if I cannot figure it out over one weekend, then I cannot do it. Because every time I roughly know what will work, what won't work. Having done all these varieties of shapes and forms has given a lot of insight into the behavior of the structure.
And I don't guess you, with technology being what it is now, there are no surprises in terms of what you can do now versus before. If something didn't work 15 years ago, it's probably not going to work now, right?
Well, that may be true, may not be true, because a lot of new innovations that we have come up with, we could not analyze to the same extent what we did then.
So your gut feeling about a design can change now based on what you know about how the technology has changed.
Exactly. The technology has helped us to solve some, what you call your difficult problems because of the limitations of the computational limitations we were not able to do. But now, because of the change in technology, we have done it. Now, I had come up with a concept of a spine structure by which you put your, which is used by a lot of other engineers also, you put your lateral system, particularly buildings which have a lot of step backs, and a lot of up and down things and openings at the bottom, tall lobbies, what have you. You cannot put the conventional tubes, perimeter tube system, because you need a lot of transfers, and it does become very cost prohibitive to do that. Instead of that, you find a common denominator, and take a bird's eye view of the building from the top, and you put your system for the wind and seismic in that common denominator, uninterrupted going down to the ground. And put all your structural system there, and all these architectural step backs and all that, you make it out a simple gravity framing. So that does not participate in the lateral system of the building. Now, we went one step further in that, knowing that we have found the common denominator. Then we went to composite systems by putting super columns, big concrete columns at the end of this, what you call this spine, so to say. And so if you put a concrete column at the end tips of this uninterrupted spine of the building, further apart you put these columns and link them together with different structural membranes, the overturning resistance of the building for wind and seismic increased substantially.
Is this kind of the outrigger system?
Outrigger systems and the super columns, which are at the end of this thing. I used that first time for building Norwest Center in Minneapolis.
And what year was that roughly?
That was 1985.
Okay.
Then I used it again, similar thing in 1989, 88, another building in Minneapolis, which was called First Bank Place. Now it is called Capella Center or something like that. And that is also spine, but that building had a lot of variations in plans. It has circles, rectangles, squares, all kinds of things, designed by late Jim Freed of Pacoff Freed Partners. So there was a spine was put, a cruciform shaped spine was put in there, with anchored by these super columns, concrete columns. And they were linked together by means of these structural membranes. And because of this spine was of a cruciform shape, it was stabilized by some additional structural elements which were provided on the perimeter of that building.
And what you're talking about here reminds me of the 1980s in two ways, and this is going to bring us into the 90s, but when I think of the 1980s from my Chicago perspective, I think of two things. Number one was the Chicago World Trade Center proposal, which was a 2,300-foot tall building, which back then was so that's when they really started pushing for just incredible heights, or when we first started hearing about that. And the second thing I think about is Caesar Pelle's Miglin-Butler Tower, which has the outrigger system that you're describing.
Yeah.
But
it had a core, concrete core walls.
Right, but this is moving us forward into the 90s now.
Right.
Which, of course, was the age of the Petronas Towers and more concrete structures. So move us forward in structural engineering,
well,
80s to 90s.
Okay. I think what has really happened, Jeff, over a number of years is people had perception of designing tall buildings in steel. That was because the technology, concrete technology, was not there. Then came the composite system with the concrete columns occupying the end of the spines and adding efficiency to the building. The concrete technology over a number of years has grown by leaps and bounds. For example, construction techniques have improved. Pumping of the concrete, getting high strength concrete into the thing, providing enough manpower to do that. And particularly, if you look at it now, the tall buildings which are built outside of United States, like Dubai Burj and so many others, in these other countries, majority of them are concrete structures. There were a lot of concrete part. And the reason for it is that the steel is very expensive, for one, in that part of the country, those parts of the country. And it is very difficult for people to build a steel structure of that magnitude in those things. But they have a lot of manpower. For example, I saw some presentation a couple of days ago which said that they had 5,000 people in one shift to build Dubai Burj Tower. While in America, we cannot think of that way. 5,000 people, where are you going to get 5,000 people to work on the basis? So I think the concept of the people before of that being tall building being only of steel, going one step into composite, is further transformed into building concrete buildings. And even we are still lacking behind in that issue in the United States. We do not have too many real, I mean, there are some Trump condominiums and things they are built, but there are not that many tall concrete buildings built in the United States.
What are some of your 1990s projects?
1990s projects were, the ones that I did were mostly either composite or were all steel buildings. I did not work on any major tall concrete building. The tallest one that I worked was like, about 50 stories, built in 47 or 48 stories, exact number I don't know, in Miami, Centrus Tower. And it was all concrete building. Now, we had preferences in this country for the southern part. We still do concrete structures, even though eastern part, because of all the steel mills and what have you, used to do steel buildings. Californians had love for the steel building because of the seismic light weight of the building. But now in California, particularly in that area, there has been an enormous evolution in terms of design technology, not necessarily technology, but design philosophy rather, by which they have gone from conventional way of designing buildings to that of performance-based design buildings. And they have started using a lot of concrete, shear walls, link beams, and using them as a performance-based and not have this conventional, what you call your prescribed design method. So the approach of design in California over the last 10, 15 years has changed dramatically.
Let's move ahead to the 2000s because now we're seeing just incredible building heights. Could you even have conceived of some of these before in 1960?
No. We just one time we had gone to Japan. They were trying to do, we were a review kind of thing. They were trying to do 2,000-foot tall building, but that was extent of. This was in 1990s sometime they were talking, but I don't know it ever materialized. It never materialized.
When did you start seeing heights like that crop up?
Well, these heights really started propping up in mid-90s, really, of this 100. As a matter of fact, we had designed one building here called One North Wacker, which was about 1,200 and some 40 feet tall, or something like that, which is pretty tall, 1,240 feet. It never got built. It was designed by, I think, Kevin Roach's office, and it never materialized. The building never materialized. So that was the one. And then after that, all these real 1,000, 2,000 feet kept on going up.
But when you look at something like the Burj Dubai or the Nakheel Tower, what do you think about in terms of structural engineering? What goes through your mind?
Well, I think something that I've found, which was kind of very interesting to me, is that the engineers and the architects work together to coming with the shape of the building in response to its height, which is a very important thing.
Much more than before.
Much more than before. There have been articles written by wind engineers and all that in the past that wind is critical in some direction and you should locate your building in this direction or what have you, or this shape is more efficient than the other shape. But it never materialized. Architects never responded to that kind of thing because architect designed what he wanted and we engineer. That's the way I worked. I never had any input into it in terms of modifying his structure, so to say, to these natural environments. Whereas if I hear about Dubai Burj, they came up with this Y-shaped building as an efficient shape, also structurally in response to its height, which is a very important thing. And I think more and more buildings will take that route. For example, putting a hole in the top of the building, which was research was done at University of Western Ontario in 1990s. And there was a building built in Dallas. Now you see a building built in China, I don't know what tower is that. They have put a hole on the top. And it is found that when you put a hole on the top, it confuses the wind onto the building, and the performance of the building increases. So the research that was done in other domain is being transferred to the buildings in terms of its physical application, which is very important, I mean, to me, trying to do that. Because old days, architect would not allow you to put a hole in the building. Things like that. Because for a very tall building with a ratio of 1 to 10, this hole in the building supposed to improve its wind performance, and which is now reflected in some of the architecture or the shape of the building. So this is a very important shift, and more tall buildings we keep on building, it will become more and more prevalent.
I'm going to ask one final question here just to kind of to finish our conversation and to bring us into the future, is that we're talking about literally cities, vertical cities being built that are just of incredible height and incredible mass, and it's going to be the structural engineers who solve those problems. What do you think of when you see cities of this size? I mean, buildings that people probably won't have to leave. How are we going to build these buildings that are 3,000 and 4,000 feet tall? Is the technology there now, or is this still evolving?
I think the technology is there now, but it's still evolving, because as the height increases, you try to face many new problems which you did not encounter when you were designing 50, 60 stories tall buildings. Another concept which is on the table, which a lot of these people are doing, super tall building, is we used to build these super columns at the end of the so-called spine and build building. Now what they're doing is they're trying to put all the core elements as a big super elements. In other words, they're not small 12 feet by 12 feet column. They're huge concrete shear walls which are put 80 feet by 50 feet, placed at different points, and they are all linked together by structural framing. So these elements have so much load on them that the wind cannot overturn them, and then they are linked together at critical locations along the height. So what we did as a super columns, these elements are really super columns, these core elements. And there is buildings designed by Norman Foster. There is a building, I think, going on somewhere in Abu Dhabi or something. I don't know whether it's materialized, whereby these pods are made up of 3 or 4 pods are put together, and they are linked together, and they go all the way up. So the super columns with the single cell buildings that we used to do, these are actually multi-cell super columns composed of the cores. In other words, there are elevators, all your mechanical services, everything is there, and they are tied together by means of structural framework. So you will start seeing those kind of buildings also coming when you start going to a different height. What essentially, Jeff, is going to happen is, as the height increases, the scale changes, your line of thinking also has to change. You cannot stay with old-fashioned, conventional way, which you did in 1940s. Even what you did in 1970s, 1980s has to be further modified.
And we certainly have the capability to do it.
Absolutely. With the new technology, both in materials and computational techniques and research, we are there.
So we have covered more than 40 years of your career, and congratulations again on your Lifetime Achievement Award.
Thank you very much.
And Dr. Prabodh Banavalkar, our guest at the Council of Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat 2009 conference.